Mike Esposito, called me up and asked me if I would come up on a Sunday. And he asked me if I could do some backgrounds. And I said, sure, I'd love to. Frank handed me these pages. He looked at me and he went like this. And I looked at the pages and they were Superman pages, you know, done by Curt Swan. So I knew, okay, we're doing something secret. I'm inking backgrounds on Superman in the offices of Marvel, right? The door opens, which was right in front of us, and Stan walks in. And I instinctively threw myself on the pages, like, you know, like that, like, you know, like they were a hand grenade, you know. Stan goes and talks to Mike and to Frank, and he comes back and he looks at me and he says, good reflexes.
Oh man, listen. Hey folks, Mark here with this month's Millarworld Comics from Dark Horse. We've got Nemesis Rogues Gallery, issue 3, Prodigy Slaves of Mars, issue 3, Nightclub 2, issue 3, The Magic Order, issue 2, and the final volume of Jupiter's Legacy, the big finale, issue 1. Don't miss it. I think we're good. I think we're doing there's a little countdown thing happening. We're on. We're good.
We're good?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, okay, I'm a wee bit late. One of my kids needed picked up at the last minute, and I had to run and catch her. You know,
of course.
Sorry about that. You know, but you good?
No, good? Don't mention it, Mark. It's your kids come first, obviously.
Look how nice and tidy your office is. That looks pretty.
Say it again, Mark.
How nice and tidy your office looks. Like mine's is always a bomb. I'm always so impressed when I see a tidy office.
It's only the small section, Mark.
It's your organised German mind. This is inside your German mind.
I think that definitely is a part of it. I would say so. Yeah. That's funnier. All right. Mark, is there any way I can turn up the volume, or you can turn up the volume?
Do you know, I have a producer who might be listening in, and he might be able to do this. Are you struggling with me? Are you? With
you, yeah, just a little bit. Yeah. If we could turn it up just a little bit, that would be good. Let me check the...
I mean, do you know what? I'll plug in. Give me a second. I'll plug in this microphone. Is that any better?
A little bit.
Right.
We can manage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't even have a cell phone. Like, genuinely, I'm like a guy from the 1940s or something. You know, like nothing. I've got no technology in my life except this. This is it.
What's your thinking on the cell phone?
I just didn't think it would catch on. I thought it was going to be one of those things like Pokemon cards that people kind of get fed up with, and I was like, these guys are idiots, you know. And then everyone had one, and I didn't, you know. So, but I kind of like it, you know.
Surprise, Mark! Surprise.
It's nice. It means when I'm out for a walk, no one can call me. If I'm in the pub, no one can call me. You know, I kind of live like a guy from 100 years ago, except for.
Yeah, but that's a nice way to live.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
It is. We really don't need it, you know.
Well, what drives me nuts is, you know, when you meet friends for lunch or out for a drink and they put their cell phone on the table. And when they go to the bathroom, I always hide their phone, you know, like, because I always think it's so rude, isn't it? You know.
Well, it's not only that, Mark. As you know, if you're like at a play in a theater or something, or in a movie, people are scrolling. It's so annoying. It's
the only time I was in an Italian restaurant with a friend of mine who's a surgeon, and he went to the bathroom and I put his in a plant pot. And he missed an important call from the hospital. And I felt kind of bad about that. That one didn't work out so well.
Well, that'll teach you, Mark. That'll teach you.
My point was made.
I think it was, actually.
Speaking of lunch, the last time I saw you was a while back, where we all bumped into each other weirdly, like in London. And
it was in London, yeah.
Like, can you remember who was at that lunch? I remember Bill Sienkiewicz was there, obviously yourself, and
I think
David Mack.
John Jr., no?
John Romita, yeah, Johnny was there, that's right, because it was pure chance I was passing by that place, because I wasn't a guest at the show or anything, and I was meeting my mother-in-law for breakfast or something, and I was just walking by and weirdly bumped into John Romita Jr., and then somehow we all got together. Yeah. It was a great lunch though, wasn't it? It was so good.
It actually was. And out of that lunch came a great picture of all of us, which I have somewhere.
If you could send me that, I'd love to see it.
Okay. It was a great lunch. I do remember that. It was great fun. Yeah. I liked it. Yeah.
And there was a director called Ben Wheatley who was passing by. Ben did the new Meg movie that came out last year, and he made a whole bunch of really brilliant British films. But Ben happened to be passing by, and he's a big comic book fan, and he looked in and saw you guys all around the table, and Ben came in to say hello and everything as well, so it was nice.
Well, that's the best thing about conventions, don't you think, Mark? Is just that spontaneity where people run into each other and then we get together. I liked Meg, by the way. Did you see Meg? I liked it.
Yeah, I thought it was really fun. It made like $500 million or something crazy as well, you know. But
that adds to the fun, I think.
Because, you know, I met the guy who wrote it years ago, like 30 years ago, one of my first times in America, and I met the guy who wrote it. I can't remember his name, but he and his writing partner sold it for $3 million. They sold the script for $3 million back in the day. And
that's amazing.
And he told me the opening scene, which I thought was amazing. Jurassic Park had just come out, and the opening scene was a T-Rex, you know, like killing a smaller dinosaur and then going down to the water and having a little drink. And then Meg comes up out the water and eats the T-Rex. And then it just cuts to 65 million years later, and it's present day New York. And I'm like, okay, I'd have paid $3 million for that. That sounds, what a great opening sequence for a film. Yeah.
That's right. I agree with you. If I had $3 million, I would pay for that, yes.
Well, you've got all those, that original art must be worth a few bob, you know, like, that's, those pages are pretty expensive to buy now, aren't they? You know.
I wish I had some, yes. Yeah. I made the mistake of getting rid of all of them.
Really?
The Dark Knight stuff, yeah. But I learned a lot from doing that. I learned not to do that. Yeah.
But I mean, so many things. I mean, we'll cover all these things, but you've worked on like everybody's favorite books over the years. You know, I mean, you've got such a brilliant track record. I think you and George Perez and a couple of guys have had the most perfect careers where almost everything has been great that you've done. You know, so those pages must be so sought after. You know, pretty much, you know, your whole catalog.
Do you have any, by the way?
I don't know, but it's made me realise I should. I'm going to go. I should track some down. You know, you go down that original art rabbit hole, and it's so dangerous, isn't it? Like I did for a little while. Yeah.
That's right. I started collecting a couple of years ago, and I had to stop because of exactly what you're talking about. It is a rabbit hole. Yeah. It never ends.
One of my friends has got the best original art collection, certainly in this country, I think possibly in the world. And he's got like complete issues of Jack Kirby Fantastic Four and things like that. You know, it's absolutely incredible.
How is that even possible?
He just tracked them down. And I think he bought quite a lot of them before they were insanely valuable, you know, when it was maybe the late 80s, early 90s.
Sure.
But even, I mean, I was looking at some Gil Kane covers from like the early 70s. You're dropping $100,000 on a cover and everything, you know. It's like things that 20 years ago would have been, you know, 4 figures are now 6+ figures. You know, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's either very, very good for the industry or very bad. I can't tell which.
Well, my wife's obsessed with me not buying it, like, because she said to me, look at Elvis memorabilia. And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, the minute all the Elvis fans started dying, the value of that stuff actually went down because there was less of a market. It's a supply and demand thing. And she said, like, those Gil Kane fans are probably all middle-aged guys right now. You know, in 20 years' time, they're going to start dying, you know, so the value won't keep growing exponentially.
You know, that's an interesting point. I think that's true. I think your wife is right.
She's very clever in everything except men. You know, but I want to put something in that though, because is peak maybe peak sales power is when the guys who grew up reading your stuff are at their peak earning power, you know, maybe 45 to 50 or something when they're earning their best salaries. Does that artificially push up comic book artwork, maybe, you know, so the guys who grew up in the 70s are now, you know, spending a lot of money on those 1970s original pages, you know.
I think you're right, and I never thought about that because, you know, what you're saying is that the market for a particular artist will decrease because the fans are not familiar with that artist's work anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although in saying that, like Ditko still gets six figures, you know, so Ditko, you have to be 70 plus really to have grown up with Ditko, you know. And Siegel and Schuster era Superman and everything, those pages are insane, you know, like what these things go for now, you know, more than almost anyone could afford. So maybe there's some characters that there's no sort of devolving, you know.
I think that's true. Spider-Man was certainly one of them. Yeah. Did you hear about that fist fight that broke out at the New York Con?
I just saw a headline saying there was a fist fight. What happened? What was
it was just, you know, just talking about or thinking about the rabid focus on what things cost and what, you know, the value of them. There was a Peach Momoko variant cover that was, I guess, released only at the New York Con. And they capped the line. And apparently the people at the end of the line didn't appreciate that. They started fighting with each other and, you know, and fists were thrown. And that was not the most discouraging thing for me. The most discouraging thing for me was they immediately flipped the cover on eBay, you know, to make a profit.
No.
And I kind of really dislike that kind of mercenary, you know, financial gain. And, but it is what it is, right, Mark? You know.
The optimist in me, though, can only see, like, I think 3 years ago, nobody would have been fighting over a comic because, you know, there wasn't much heat in the market at the time. So the optimist in me thinks, as bad as it is for guys to be fighting at a show, that's a sign that people are kind of interested in comics, you know. So like as an indicator, you know. But I do feel a fight at a comic book show is going to be a pretty gentle fight, though. I don't imagine. Did anyone actually get hurt?
No. They at the convention was very security conscious, and they had a lot of people around, and so on and so on. Mark, where do you think we're going in comics? Where do you think?
I think it's a great question, you know, because I think the West as a whole is in this massive period of change, which we can't even begin to fathom right now. You know, I mean, between AI, globalization, all these kind of things, everything is changing. And in our little worlds, you know, our tiny piece of that is undergoing its big change too. But I actually think I think this year's been quite nice in comics, you know, like I'd say the last 6, 7, 8 years, my numbers I'm reading in Western comics has shrunk catastrophically. I hardly read anything at all now, you know, where I read more international stuff now, really. You know, I've really got into European stuff recently. But it's interesting because I actually think this year there's been a bit of a turning point. And I think it's the love affair with Hollywood has maybe slowed down a little bit as well. So it's brought a lot of the good creators back. So I left comics as a mainstream thing in 2017. I went full time in the studio. But a lot of people have been sort of floating around the sort of Hollywood scene. But during COVID and then the contraction of the studios themselves, there's just not a lot of work going. So you're starting to see people coming back to comics, which I think is really healthy because writers in particular, I think it fell off a cliff for quite a while, and brilliant people are coming back. Like Scott Snyder's just had an amazing hit with Absolute Batman. You've got Jonathan Hickman over doing good stuff in the Ultimate line, Ultimate Spider-Man and so on. So I don't know, I feel what it feels like to me, and you're the man I'd like to ask this actually, because it feels to me like about 1976, you know, like where it's almost been a collapse, but it's starting to turn around and you can sort of see the green shoots of recovery. You know, like Superman, Spider-Man is just about to happen, or the Star Wars comics just about to happen. These things that eventually built us up into the 1980s. And I don't know, when I talk to retailers, they seem a little bit more optimistic than they were last year. What's your reading of it yourself? What do you think?
I try to look at it from the point of view that there's two groups that we need to pay attention to. There's the mainstream comics, the established companies, Marvel, DC, obviously. And then there's a secondary group, which I think is growing larger and larger, which are the independent artists, the independent writers that are not working for mainstream, but have access to social media and to newsletters and to all sorts of outlets. And I think they're becoming rapidly very large and establishing themselves as almost an alternative market. So I try to look at it from that point of view, that there are definitely two entities that are not, and they're not really competing with each other. I think they have a very different audience, but definitely the mainstream comics seem to be decreasing in popularity or in sales, whereas the independent market seems to be growing, not only in terms of fans and the sales, but also in terms of the numbers of people that are investing in their time and money into that market. And I find that really interesting. So I don't think you're incorrect by saying it's like 1976, but it's 1976 with that alternative market, I think.
Well, it's funny because, you've got the microcycles in comics, which I think are roughly 20 years, where you have the kind of Silver Age, the Golden Age, the Dark Age and everything. But then I think there's these broader ones, which are 40-year cycles, so you had the newsstand for 40 years, probably from around about the late 30s to the late 70s. And then after Phil Seuling, you had the direct market becoming a thing. And those 40 years, I feel that they're coming to an end just now as well. When you say the independent sector, do you mean the direct-to-consumer stuff, like, the Kickstarter kind of things, as opposed to the independent comics that are sold in traditional comic stores?
Yes, definitely. And I think, part of the mechanism by which these independent artists and writers, of course, have access to the public is through various social media platforms, which, didn't exist 10, 20 years ago. And the people that I'm talking to, especially at the con, and a bunch of us had lunch yesterday, they seem to really confirm that they don't need the mainstream publishers anymore, and they're doing just fine. Yeah.
I mean, people I know are making independent comics. They're making way more money than Marvel and DC guys on this direct-to-consumer thing. So if you can sell 10,000 units of a direct-to-consumer book like Eric July would do, Eric pulled in like $4 million on one 65-page book, which is incredible, So
I agree.
It feels like one of those paradigm shifts, like newsstand to comic store to this. But I wonder if we can also just have it all. I wonder if we can.
I think so.
Like a specialist store is really attractive if for the casual buyer who's maybe seeking stuff out online,
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that those two groups can coexist comfortably.
Yeah.
I agree with that, yeah. And I think it's healthy.
Yeah. And I think that if you think about it, people kind of complain that we can't get in supermarkets anymore and everything, but what people always forget as well is Marvel used to publish about 15 books back then. DC maybe published about 20 books, so you could get them all in a store. You could have 3 copies of each one in a store. But now the industry is about 600 or 700 books, and it would mean gigantic job losses, if we just went back to what was in the supermarket. Plus, you could never have anything like Saga or any of the adult stuff or anything in the supermarkets.
Right.
So we kind of have an amazing thing there with something like Amazon too, where for the casual reader, no matter where you live in the world, you can lay your hands in a comic book even more conveniently than you could in the 60s and 70s, I think.
There seems to be a resiliency to the form itself, which I find comforting.
And I remember reading an interview with Denny O'Neil years ago when I was a teenager, and they were talking about Dark Knight. Funnily enough, they were saying to Denny, "Did you ever think Batman would be this hot again?" Because Batman went cold in the 70s, early 80s. And he says, I'll be honest with you. He said, back in the 70s, mid-70s, we didn't think we'd have jobs in a couple of years. He said, we thought, and that's when I realised it did move in cycles and somebody just comes in and reinvents the wheel. You know, so when it's at its nadir, there's someone comes in, some young guy usually who's about 30, you know, and then
that's right.
it up, you know?
That's right. I'm, you know, and I was, you mentioned Snyder's Absolute Batman. Mm-hmm. It's impressive to see that there is a way of tapping into the excitement of the medium and the characters and the people who produce the comics that still can, you know, let's face it, make money for the companies. Yeah. And not only make money, but extend the life of the characters.
Mm-hmm. And then in turn, what you get from there is, I mean, if we look at things historically, this is wonderful for creators in general, because I know, for example, that my first foray into creator-owned work exploded because I'd just done some big Marvel books, you know. So if people do these big Marvel DC books and rebuild things up again, then you use that as a launch pad into your own material, you know. So everybody wins, you know.
And I think now what's happening, there's movement from one to the other, or the other to the one. There's more back and forth movement. Whereas earlier, as you correctly point out, it used to be, you know, you'd get established at Marvel and DC and then maybe go to Image and do your own IP. But now there's much more back and forth. It's much more fluid. And again, I find that really interesting and a positive sign.
Well, we're due one, you know, because the way I did a sign graph years ago where I was looking at the trends and when things would dip, when things pick up.
Sure.
And we've actually been due one for a few years for somebody to come in and reinvent the wheel like this, you know, like the way that John Broome and Gardner Fox and Julie Swartz did it with DC and Stan and Jack over at Marvel. You know, they all kind of happen around about the same time, usually within a 5-year window. And then there's 15 years of living off those very fertile 5 years. You know, we had it obviously in the 80s and everything as well. And then more recently with the Joe Quesada era Marvel, Dan DiDio, DC and everything, you know. So there's always an amazing spurt of creativity that gets everybody excited. Then it kind of calms down a little bit. And then there's a kind of a slowdown again, you know.
Yeah. You give me hope, Mark.
There's I mean, one thing you know from superhero comics, it's never the end, you know, like it's
right. I hope that's true, but you're right. It is.
Because I always think of you, because I discovered you in the early 80s, I always think of that as being the beginning of your career. And then when I would go back and get back issues, I would see your name years before that, you know, like, you know, you're doing Sal Buscema, Avengers and everything, you know, as a Defender, sorry, you know, and like, you know, so you came on the scene actually quite early, didn't you? I mean, you must have been a really young guy when you started, like. So I know you were born in Germany and everything. So what was your path? Where did you come from, and what was that journey to Marvel?
You know, I was born in Germany, and my parents moved to America when I was 5, and I discovered, you know, it was a very completely different existence between being in Germany. I went to kindergarten in Germany and first grade in America. And, you know, I was just so amazed at what America represented to me, which was television, because we had no TV back in Germany, and orange soda. I could not believe orange soda was like the most delicious thing I've ever tasted. But around the corner from where we lived was a very much a mom and pop store, which sold, you know, some candy, a few cigars, and comic books. And, you know, maybe some stationery, you know, just a real mom and pop store. Yeah. And I learned how to read and write by deciphering Mort Weisinger comic books, Superman comics, basically, Lois Lane, Superman, Jimmy Olsen, that whole line. And I think, you know, the power of images was really embedded within me in that experience. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the fact that I could figure out the language by looking at the images and looking at the panels. Mm-hmm. And by the time I went into first grade, which was really only a couple of months, I was, more or less able to keep up with the lessons, and I had a fundamental understanding of the language, through comics. I never went to art school, which I wish I would have, but we couldn't afford it, being a first generation immigrant. So I think that this was a hobby, but I also knew that very early on, this is what I wanted to do. I loved telling stories. Reading those Weisinger comics, those Superman comics, I used to cut them apart and reposition the figures and make my own stories, and I realized at a certain point, I'm really destroying my comics. And so I started to draw them, and draw the stories and make up my own stories. And somewhere, they still exist, and every once in a while I'll come across them, and it's, incredibly sad to see how amateurish, I was 6, I was 7, but I was captured by the medium and by the possibility of telling stories.
And were your mum and dad speaking German at home, or, were you...
They did almost exclusively until much later. And I was their official interpreter, and I would go to the store with them, and they'd buy groceries or go to the bank, and I would be the interlocutor, which I did not appreciate, by the way. But it is, it is what it is. So yeah.
One of my friends is Chinese, and he came over here when he was 5, and his mum and dad just put him straight into an American school speaking Chinese, not a word of English. And he said that he met a Dutch boy on his first day at school, and they were the only 2 kids who didn't speak English, and they couldn't understand each other, but they became best friends because they were the only kids nobody else could understand,
Oh, I love that story. That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah.
I think that it toughens you up, I guess, doesn't it? He said he learned English pretty fast when he had to.
Yeah, you do have to. You're caught in this maelstrom of Americanism and school especially. So you really had to catch up fast. Yeah. And I was a pretty good student too, I think. Maybe as a result of that.
It's funny because I hadn't thought about it just now, because I think of the genealogy of all my favourite artists, right? And I remember copying your art. So there's a few guys I really copied when I was trying to be an artist. And I used to love your ink line especially, but I love the broadness of your characters and everything too. And I used to always sit and try and analyse what made your stuff work, because you're such a natural, instinctive layout guy. Your composition's beautiful and everything, but you kind of had your own style. But it's only as you're saying it now, I can sort of see like Wayne Boring a little bit in you as well. Like those big, broad Superman kind of images. Was that an influence on you as a kid? That kind
of? Not consciously, but I wouldn't discount that at all. I think that, there is a certain simplicity to those guys that is still very much valid. Wayne Boring or Kurt Swan, Kurt Schaffenberger, which I kind of liked. So there is a validity to that approach. Absolutely, yeah.
Swan's my all-time favorite artist. Like I'm obsessed with Kurt Swan. He's so great.
Who?
Kurt Swan. He's my favorite.
Kurt Swan?
Yeah.
There's a very comforting, familial feeling to what he does. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. I didn't know, Mark. I didn't know that until you had mentioned it in an email that you were drawing for a long period of time. I assume you wanted to be an artist.
Yeah, but I realised how hard it was. I actually went. I went to. Have you heard of the Society of Strip Illustrators, which used to be a kind of a club in London back in the 70s and 1980s?
No, I don't think so. No.
You would have liked it. It was run by David Lloyd, and it was a once a month meetup. And the guys would all get together. About 100 people. Like quite a lot of people would go along. Anyone who worked in British comics was kind of living around the London area, and they would meet up in this place once a month and have a drink. And Dick Giordano, Karen Berger, Jeanette Cann, everybody would come once a year. and come and have a look and poach new talent. So that's where they would find the next Brian Boland or whatever, And I went down to that and I stood in a queue, a line of about 80, 100 people, like a lot of people showing samples. And the guy in front of me was a professional artist, he's a good artist. And he had a portfolio and he had these beautifully inked pages that he was showing to Giordano, hoping to get some work. And I remember I had a maths jotter, like the square paper you get for maths, with lots of drawings of Batman and things in it, and I just felt, I was only 18, but I was like, they're never going to take me seriously. And that was the end of my art career. I was like, I'm not even showing these guys this,
But tell me that it did not serve you well, that experience in drawing for that year or two, that did serve you well later on in terms of your own writing.
Well, I think thinking visually is so important. I mean, because comic books isn't radio plays. It's not
sure.
Prose,
That's right.
You've got to always think, is this going to be cool to look at, and will it be fun for the artist to draw? So I try and keep it under 4 panels a page if I can, and that's stuff you learn when you're sitting doing your own comics. Like, you don't want a bunch. Nobody wants to draw 20 pages of talking heads.
I wanted to ask you, where did you learn, or how did you eventually get good at writing?
I think it was by, like everything else, just failing for a number of years, and then there being a turning point, So, like, 'cause to me, you seem like a guy who arrived fully formed. Like, you seem to know what you were doing right away. I mean, I started pretty young. I was sending in submissions from I was 13, writing submissions and some art submissions. And then by 18, I was working full time, which is kind of crazy, And I was working pretty steadily through my 20s. I was doing okay, but nothing made any kind of real impact. I was 29, 30 before anybody really paid attention to what I was doing. But that theory, I think it's Malcolm Gladwell has that theory about the 10,000 hours thing. And I think there's really something in it, isn't there? Because 10,000 hours is roughly the length of a university degree. And it's an apprenticeship to become a plumber or a carpenter or something, isn't it? Do you subscribe to that as an artist because there's such a skill level?
Absolutely. And I believe the 10,000 hours very much. I don't think that I really got, there were two pivots in my career that helped me enormously to move the ball forward, so to speak. One was obviously working with Frank and accepting more responsibility for the product, for the end product. And the other thing which moved the ball forward quite a bit was teaching, because I realized after 2 weeks in my first semester teaching, I knew nothing. And I was out of material already. I mean, in 2 weeks, I told them everything that I knew. And so I really had to go back and learn and study and in a lot of ways develop my own theory about what works and what doesn't. And I found one of the interesting things that I found out was that if you really objectively look at the rules and theories of art, that we all sort of get to the same point. The rules of composition are standard, no matter who does them or in what form you do them. A painter will still use the same rules of composition that I use in every panel. So eventually, perspective, right? Perspective is perspective. You're not going to, alter perspective. So we sort of eventually get to that same point where there is a commonality amongst the fundamentals of the mechanics of storytelling. However, storytelling in and of itself, beyond the mechanics, is very subjective and very personal. So there's that objective, factual, concrete rules of composing or using perspective or camera angles. There are only about 12 or 15 camera angles, and they're the same camera angles that are available to you, to me, or, Joe Schmo on the street. There are no more. You can't, that's it. But the choices that we make and in terms of storytelling and the relationship of images on a page, that's very personal and that's very subjective. And I find that to be fascinating.
But because you're also a teacher, like, do you think this stuff is instinctive in an artist, or do you think it's something that they can learn at something like the Kubert School or one of the Italian comic book art schools or something? Do you think this stuff can be taught, or do you think there has to be a huge element of natural understanding?
I think that it can be taught. I've certainly seen it. I've seen that happen. But I think the requisite or the required characteristic that is necessary for someone to learn it is their personality. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the determining factor in as regards to whether or not they succeed or fail. And succeed and fail are in air quotes. Whatever they think is success or failure. But I've seen people come into class who can draw, better than I can. Mm-hmm. And because they have a really crappy personality, whatever it is, their inability, their lack of curiosity, I find to be fundamentally determinative. And also, if you have curiosity, that obviously is a recipe for success. But I find that it can be taught, but it can be taught to people who want to learn and who want to understand the form. If you have some sort of a shitty attitude or some sort of a chip on your shoulder or whatever it is, it's a myriad amount of issues that kids have, or we all have. But that seems the personality is the thing that determines success or failure.
Have you ever seen a student come in who didn't read comics growing up, but they were a terrific illustrator who learned how to work in the language of comics?
Yes.
I've never met any pros who didn't grow up reading comics, But has that happened with you? Then somebody has come in?
Yeah. I remember a kid named Byron a couple of years ago who never read a comic and really wasn't even a good drawer. Mm-hmm. And within a year, he was doing work that was inventive and creative and interesting. Yeah. Lots of good ideas, not only in terms of, how to draw or how to arrange a page, but in terms of stories. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really depends on the individual. Unfortunately, it does.
That's really interesting because one of my pals, he's a fantastic portrait painter. He makes an amazing living as a portrait painter. And he said to me years back, he said, I'd love to try comics. And I gave him a script and says, look, do some sample pages and I'll send it in. And he got 2 pages in and he said he was having a nervous breakdown. He said that every panel felt like a painting and every panel had to relate to every other panel and also then look good as a singular page. And he was like, I can't do this. It's just
Well, he may have entered, this experiment a bit too late. Yeah. Because, he's already very much solidified in terms of how he approaches, art.
Yeah.
But I think if you catch them, in their teenage years, it's still doable. Yeah.
Hello there. Do you love big, expensive hardcovers? So do I. Dark Horse do these beautiful library editions, and we've got a whole ton of them coming up. The first one out is October for a collection, oversized, of Wanted and Big Game. Coming in December, you have The Ambassadors with the greatest living comic book artists. I'm talking Frank Whiteley, Olivier Coipel, Matteo Scalera, just all your favourites. You've got to check this out. And in January, the big one, The Magic Order, collecting Volumes 1 and Volumes 2 of the original series. Art by Olivier Coipel and Stuart Immonen. Story by me. You're going to love it. Well, speaking of Curt Swan, I don't know if you ever heard this, but Curt, as he entered his kind of 70s, whatever, he was aware there was a lot of young guys coming through. There was the John Byrnes and Frank Millers and everybody in the early 80s, And he was a little worried that his stuff was looking a little out of date. It was a bit classical for that very experimental period. And I don't know if you heard this, but Joe Kubert sat with him, and Al Williamson, I think, sat with him as well. And they actually, like, they would meet once a week and rethink the way he drew. He wanted to learn even at that stage, which I always thought was amazing. You know, you've been the premier DC artist for 30 years, and you've got the humility to try and rethink the way you work, you know.
I hear Tim Sale used to tell me stories about how he would take the John Buscema class up at Marvel. And I'm just, astounded that such a thing existed, that you would be able to talk to or learn from someone like John Buscema or, Joe Kubert that you mentioned. Al Williamson, these guys were top of the line, the best of the best. That period of time, by the way, was a very, I would say, very heady, very much fun, very stimulating and provocative in terms of it. That period of time was, it provoked people into being creative and interesting and competitive. There was a certain competition going on, and everybody wanted to do, better than the other guy. It was fascinating. It was really, and to a great degree, I recognize that will never happen again. This was pre-FedEx, pre-digital. We were all sort of in a locked into the tri-state community, which was great fun.
And it's a bunch of guys in their 20s who are all into the same thing. There must have been tremendous friendships formed in that sort of second half of the 70s, first half of the 80s. Did you get really tight with some of the guys?
I did, yeah. I've always been very, especially, in that day, I'm a little less so introverted, but I've always been I've leaned toward being introverted a bit. And also intimidated by, people that are, more talented than I am. I remember seeing Jack Kirby in the office one day, and everybody was, circling around him and paying homage and, loving him and stuff. And I did not, because, what did I have to say to Jack Kirby? I had nothing to say, how could I possibly say anything to Jack Kirby? I've gotten less so as time goes on, but there are definitely friendships from back then. Walter Simonson, I think of as a very good friend. So that have endured.
Because when I was at Marvel, things were getting a little bit more international, but there was still a real focus with DC and Marvel being in the city. Maybe twice a week or something, everybody used to go out for a drink and all go to the same bars, so you kind of would always bump into everyone, But the 70s must have been even more so, because everyone took the train into the office from their home.
Yeah, that's right, and it was a way of refreshing your positive energy, if I could say that. And this, Mark, I'm sure that, those lunches or those meetings or those, Friday night bar drink-a-thons. It was a way of revitalizing your own ability. You felt the next day like drawing. Yeah. You felt better about yourself and about what you were doing, because the problems were all the same. We all had the same problems. We all had the same issues. We all dealt with the same deadlines, and it was good to have that commonality. It was necessary to have that commonality.
Because one of my friends had a great expression about a creative community, and they said, steel forges steel. And I think there's something in that, that it's no accident that these guys all appear around the same time, because they're all having a friendly, sometimes competition with each other as well. And you're inspired by your peers, and it pushes everybody to a new height, doesn't it? So I don't think you guys come along in isolation, or the DC guys of that period came along in isolation, you were all probably keeping an eye on what each other was doing and then trying to push it a little bit further?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think one of the things that I've recognized or realized as time goes on, our generation, the ones that came in the 70s and maybe the early 80s, but, in that general area, we had a different motive for entering comics than the generation that came before us. I think that the generation that came before us was motivated largely by a World War II aesthetic, by the collapse of comics in the 50s, by the collapse of illustration in magazines. And so a lot of these guys, went into comics to support their family. Sure. And my generation didn't need to do that. We were okay already, in terms of generating some income and supporting our families, or, being able to survive financially. Our motivation, I believe, was to change the medium, whether it was a collective consciousness that we shared. I don't know if that is true. But looking back on it, everyone seemed to want to do something that was significant and would change the medium. We weren't concerned about the page rate as much as we were concerned about the page itself.
It's a great generation, though, isn't it? Because to be born in, because you're post World War II, you're pre World War III. It's like you don't have those adult concerns.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, Mark. Yeah.
Your mum and dad's had a different life from the life that you've had. And it means you can focus on fun. So I think the boomers and the Gen Xers really love being young and don't really like the idea of growing up. I think that we're all fixated on the things we loved as children still, I think. In a way our parents weren't. Our parents grew up really fast, didn't they? But we've tried to stay young for as long as possible, I think.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, that is correct. Yeah. For better or worse, too. But yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah.
And so I remember hearing that Giordano was pivotal in the beginning for you. Did you do some work for that independent company that he had back in the 70s, or was it in his DC time? When did your first work that you sold?
I met Dick. I had read a short 2-page comic strip in Captain Action, one of the Captain Action books. And it was about this fan who participated in a tour of DC, the DC offices. And I took it upon myself to go to DC from Connecticut. I got on the train, I got dressed up, and I wanted to join and do a tour. And when I got to the office, and those were the days when you could just walk into the office and nobody would, blink twice. But the receptionist said to me, "Oh, we don't do tours anymore. Sorry." And I think, one of my favorite memories is that, I'm sure my lip quivered a bit, and I looked at her and I said, but I'm wearing a tie. Don't you understand? I got duded up for this whole thing, So she felt bad for me, and I wish I could remember her name or knew her name, because she got Jack Miller, who was one of the editors at the time, to come out and give me a tour. So long story short, I met a bunch of the people in the office, including Dick Giordano. And Dick recognized me from all the letters that I had written to Charlton while he was editor at Charlton. Yeah. And as coincidence would have it, or, synchronicity, whatever you want to call it, he lived in the town bordering mine. And I told him I wanted to be an artist. And he said, come up, show me your pages. Mm-hmm. And so I did. And we formed a friendship. And at one point he said to me, which I thought was absolutely magical in terms of what a teacher would say to a student. He looked at a page and he said, "This is a good page." And if you can do one good page, you can do another. Wow. And I thought, this is just magic,
That's
and it gave me, pardon me? Go ahead, Mark.
That's like Kung Fu, isn't it? That's like some Zen wisdom you've just been given.
Absolutely, it was. And I look back on it and I'm in awe of that sentence,
Yeah.
But I became his assistant for a year, and I was just very, very hungry to get out of Connecticut and to strike out on my own. And I moved to New York, I think, when I was 21. And so my apprenticeship with him came to an end, and I started working on my own. But Dick was invaluable in terms of what I learned from him, not only about comics, but about business, about being responsible, about making your deadlines, about playing well with others. One of his best pieces of advice was, don't be a jerk. Because I was being a jerk at the time. And I took it to heart. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, a wonderful teacher, a wonderful mentor, a wonderful friend. He was the one that asked me to do Dark Knight. I remember.
I assumed that was Miller. Was that Giordano?
Frank asked Dick. And Dick, and I remember walking down the hallway at DC Comics, and Dick was rattling change in his pocket, and always smiling because he was genuinely the happy warrior.
Yeah.
And, he came up to me and he said, I remember we were like this close, and he said, Frank is doing a Batman project, and he wants to know if you want to ink it. And not knowing even what it was, I said, of course I want to ink it. And I think that's just basically how my entry into the project began.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. 'Cause I remember Giordano inked Frank Miller around about that time as well, just a couple of years before. He did a World's Finest cover. And Dick, I was going to ask you about inking because... I think inking is quite undervalued, I think, to, what it was like in the 70s and 80s, where an inker could save a page and a bad inker could ruin a page and everything as well, And somebody like Giordano you could tell it was a Giordano ink job, couldn't you? No matter who he was working with. Even Frank Miller, who's one of the most easily identifiable pencilers you'll ever meet, you can tell Giordano's done the finish on it, can't you?
Yeah.
And I do think it's interesting because... So a lot of the really great artists like you, Bill Sienkiewicz, Kevin Nowlan, have been drawn to inking, and Dick Giordano as well, have been drawn to inking probably more than you've penciled, all of you. And to me, it's always been fascinating because I love to see you draw the whole thing. But what is that thing that pulls you into the inking instead of penciling and inking?
Well, what happened was I went to a Phil Suling con when I was probably 18, maybe 17, somewhere around there, and I had a fanzine that I was working on in collaboration with a friend of mine, David, and who is still a friend of mine, which I appreciate very much. And I had some pages from that fanzine and some other stuff that I was working on. It was all Batman, the usual stuff. And I was walking around, and Gil Kane came out of a ballroom, and obviously from some sort of a panel or whatever they were doing at that time. And I thrust these pages into his hands, and which was I think the right thing to do. And I asked him after he looked at the pages, how long, I said to him, how long do you think I have before I can, work in this industry? And referring to my pencils, he said, well, about 3 years. And then I said, well, how long do you think I have before I can work in this industry as an inker? And he said, no, about a year. And I said, okay, that's what I'll do.
That's amazing.
then that is my ticket. So I started focusing more on inking and listen, Mark, I can't tell you how much I learned from inking, these people, including Gil. I think my second job was inking Gil Kane, who is my favorite American artist. I just love his stuff. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
No, I was just agreeing. I was just nodding in agreement. Like, Kane to me, like, in terms of every year I get older, I appreciate him more and more. You know, what he was doing. And as a kid, I didn't like him inking himself. I always liked somebody to soften him. But as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, this is the crack cocaine version of Gil Kane. You know, like, I want to see him ink himself now, you know, because he's got such an amazing finish on his own stuff, you know.
Yeah, I think Gil, you know, those of us within the industry, you know, whatever we know, but I think he had certain, he was prone to self-sabotage, I think. You know, reading his interviews, his self-denigration, his insecurities, his inability to understand that he was really an amazing artist. And I think there was always something outside of his reach that haunted him, which I find interesting because I suspect we have a little bit of that. All of us have a little bit of that. But yeah, his composition was second to none. His transition from the DC Gil Kane to the Marvel Gil Kane was phenomenal. That anybody could do that is astounding. So I look at his stuff all the time.
I heard a rumor that at that point, late 60s, early 70s, he could draw 4 or 5 pages a day. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, he was motivated to make some money. And he was able to. And a lot of those covers that he did were apparently he came up with the images and they would write the stories around them. They were not editorially sanctioned. So he, you know, if he found himself to have a 10-minute break or an hour of free time, he just whipped these covers out. And, you know, they were all phenomenal. They were all terrific.
And now try finding one for under 50 grand now. Impossible.
Yeah, that's right. But, I wish he would see that, actually. Yeah.
Well, I think it's like Ditko as well, isn't it? I mean, Ditko pages are going for 6 figures now, you know, like everything. And it's a shame these guys, you know, they were getting 150 a page or something, probably, if they were lucky.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But,
Did you ever meet Ditko?
No, we worked together, and I got on a 4 or 5 page story or something, you know, and I got a nice letter from him in my 20s. But we never actually got to meet, and I'm kind of glad in a way, because, you know, there's some people shouldn't exist in the real world. Like, I feel as if Ditko should never have to go and order a coffee or something like that. He should just exist in some astral plane, you know, like Steve and Jack Kirby as well. These guys kind of remain on Mount Rushmore to me because I never met them as human beings, you know.
I like that, Mark. That's pretty cool. I remember Neil Adams had this. I don't know if I read this in a you know, read it or I heard it or he, you know, we were talking or whatever. But he had this theory that Jack would just stay at his desk all day, his drawing table, and that when, you know, the sunset and the evening approached, Roz would come in, pick him up, and put him in the closet. And he would just vibrate all night, and then she would bring him out in the morning and put him back at his desk. You know, because he was just such a source of energy. Yeah. That's
amazing. I love that. When you see a picture of Jack Kirby's desk, I saw this a few weeks ago on Twitter. I think his granddaughter or his grandson put a picture up, and it was just this little wooden desk with a cup beside it and some pens and brushes and things.
Yeah.
And it really humanized him, you know. It was really weird, something that it's like seeing the Turin Shroud or the Cross of Christ or something like that, you know. It's like, this is something that should be too big, and yet it's just a physical object, you know.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you. I felt the same way when I saw that. And then, have you ever seen Joe Kubert's desk?
No, I've seen lots of pictures of his office, but not his desk specifically.
Right.
No.
His drawing table was enormous. It was an architect's table. Yeah, so it was the opposite of what Jack used. Jack's was very small, yeah.
Which is funny because Kubert was all about the minutiae, wasn't it? His artwork really felt like it zoomed in, where Kirby's art was the size of the universe, wasn't it?
You know, I never thought of that. I think you're right about that. So it was the opposite of the drawing table.
It was their imagination, I guess, from where they were, you know?
Yeah, that's right. How interesting, yeah.
So you must have been one of the few people who come into Marvel at its lowest ebb, which I think is probably quite interesting for creators now to hear, you know, when things are tough at these companies, you know. But like, did you have that sense Denny O'Neil talked about around about 1976, 77, 78, that this could be the last year in the business and things were contracting? Or did you have that optimism that you have in your early 20s where you think it's going to be fine, it'll be okay?
You know, I have to confess that I did have that optimism. I never paid a lot of attention to all of their stories, the doom and gloom stories. And there was a lot of that. Everybody, you know, pretty much assumed that comics were on the way out. Mm-hmm. I never bought into that. I think probably because I was naive and I was young and I didn't want it to happen. I'm sure that was a part of it. But I had enthusiasm and optimism to spare. So I never bought into that at all. But you're totally correct in that we were surrounded by that energy. There was the expectation of, 5 years at the most. And of course that proved to be not true. And perhaps that 5 years, kind of a deadline allowed the people to take some risks and some chances. And I think one of the things that marked that period is a sense of improvisation. Mm-hmm. With the characters and with the formats and with different ideas. It was just a lot of fun. I always go back to that word, and I feel like I'm being repetitive and trite, but it was, it was fun. It was a community feeling. The bullpen was a real bullpen, full of really, interesting characters. People would smoke in the office, there was a bit of, who's that writer? Runyon? Is it Paul Runyon? Who's that from the 40s? But there was that feeling of, early on, before I really started getting my own gig, Mike Esposito, whom I had met during one of my portfolio reviews, called me up and asked me if I would come up on a Sunday to the office. And can you imagine the office being open on Sunday and just having people, come in and work? Yeah. And he asked me if I could do some backgrounds. And I said, sure, I'd love to. And he was sitting there with Frank Giacoia, of course, who, they were partners. Mm-hmm. And Frank handed me these pages, and he looked at me, and he went like this. And I looked at the pages, and they were Superman pages, done by Curt Swan. So I knew, okay, we're doing something secret. I'm inking backgrounds on Superman in the offices of Marvel, right? And as I'm doing this, the door opens, which was right in front of us, and Stan walks in.
Oh my God!
And I instinctively threw myself on the pages, like that, like they were a hand grenade, And I thought, oh, okay. I saved everybody's, keister here. And Stan goes and talks to Mike and to Frank, and he comes back and he looks at me and he says, "Good reflexes."
Oh man,
yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, no, it was great. And I realized I didn't fool anybody, and he was okay with it. He knew what was going on. It was not a big deal. We were all, in the same boat, rowing in the same direction. Yeah.
And it must have been amazing then when you did see things picking up, probably by early 80s when X-Men's getting big, and then Daredevil went through that exponential jump. You know, that must have been really exciting for you to be the guy. You'd been working on the book for a few years at this point.
That's right. Before Frank came on, I was working on the book for a while. My job was the continuity guy. I had to, you know, make sure that Matt Murdock's hair was parted on the correct side, or his glasses were the same, right? You know, that kind of stuff. When we cared about continuity, now we don't care about continuity anymore. Yeah, it was great fun, Mark. It's exciting, you know, and I think most of it was because of that community feeling.
And were the creators aware when things were exploding in the early 80s, like, you know, the sort of John Burns, the Claremonts, yourself, Frank? Yeah. Were you aware that this was, you know, because there was no internet to tell you this was big, but did you have a feeling of heat?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Probably not to the degree that it was happening, but we knew, you know, Daredevil was bi-monthly, as you know, and then it went to monthly. And of course, that's a big sign of, you know, validation and that you're doing the right thing. And then the death threats would, you know, start coming in, and then we really knew we were on the right track. You know? So yeah, we had a sense of it, but you know, I was at the New York Con over the weekend, and somebody, which is the perennial question, you know, did you know that Daredevil was going to be as big as it became, or Dark Knight, or any of those books? And no, we did not know that, or that it would have legs. You know, that work still is, you know, admired to this day. We didn't. I don't know if anybody thought like that, actually. Yeah.
But like, because the sales data wasn't as available, you know, were royalties starting to kick in at that point, or did the royalties come a little bit later? I know the 80s was when Marvel started paying royalties.
Yeah, I forget what year the royalties kicked in, but it was, I think Jim Shooter takes credit for that. So it obviously was during that Jim Shooter period.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the royalties started coming in during Daredevil. That would make sense.
See, growing up, I used to always think of Daredevil as a real B or C list character. You know, it wasn't one of those Spider-Man, Fantastic Four kind of things.
That's correct. Yeah.
And, you know, as a concept, it's not a brilliant concept. You know, it's like a blind guy who can sort of see sometimes, you know, it's like, and he's got no superhuman strength or anything. And yet it's had such amazing creative teams on it that the character's almost been artificially elevated to A-list, really, because there's always somebody great working on Daredevil. It seems to attract in great talent, doesn't it?
Yeah, and what do you think it is? I'm not sure what it is. Is it the humanity of it, or?
I think sometimes you just need to have one great run and then everybody wants a shot, you know, like if Daredevil hadn't had you and Frank, would it have been super attractive to Joe Quesada or Bendis or any of the guys who came along later, you know? Because then you're inspired by what you've seen and you want to do it. Like Swamp Thing is the same. Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson doing Swamp Thing. Who doesn't want to have a shot at that, you know? And so there was all these amazing teams come into that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mark. I think that is true, yeah.
And Batman's probably the same too, isn't it? You know, like Batman's a great concept, but Batman had 10 years where nobody cared about it, you know? Like up until the mid-80s. I mean, I was reading it, I liked it. But other than Steve Englehart, from about 1971 until about 1986, nobody was really reading Batman, you know?
Yeah, that's right. I think too that, and tell me if you agree, that Daredevil and Batman have a lot in common. Certainly, you know, non-superpowered, but I always think about the supporting cast, which I think is the villains, you know, which is the supporting cast. And both of them have wonderful, you know, Ben Urich, Perry White, you know, all of those analogs. They're just wonderful characters. They're wonderful characters to draw. They're wonderful characters to read about. I had the experience. I did most recently a Last Halloween with Jeff Loeb, the second issue, which I think will be out next week. Cool. But the one of the villains in it was the Penguin, And I thought, I have no affinity for this character at all. And it turned out to be an extraordinarily fun experience to draw the Penguin. I looked at it like he was Elmer Fudd, like a cartoon character, which is not what they're doing in the HBO series by any means. But I found that hook, to the character, and I found myself just enjoying the hell out of it.
And did you lean into did you lean into the Dick Sprang of it all then? You went classic Silver Age Penguin, yeah?
Yeah, more in the classic vein. Yeah, more so than, say, the Colin Farrell version. Yeah.
And have you coloured it as well?
Pardon me?
Have you coloured it too?
No, I didn't color it. Dave Stewart colored it, but I penciled and inked it, and Jeff, of course, wrote it. I think it's one of my best efforts, actually. I'm really proud of it. Yeah,
I can't wait to see it. Like I love it when you pencil, ink, and color. That's my favorite.
Thank you.
I'll take any of those three. Like you did a really great Superman story that I keep some things on my desk sometimes just to inspire me. When I'm blocking on something and I can't.
We all do, Mark. Yeah.
So some very random things, from 40 years ago or whatever. And your Superman DC Presents with Adam Strange, the one you penciled, inked it, and coloured it. I love some of the choices you made in it. I remember it so clearly. The fourth panel on the first page and everything. This big close up of the Russian guy screaming, stuff like that. You made it all so interesting. It was great.
I appreciate that, Mark. That's really, thank you. You know who else says something similar about that issue is Brian Hitch.
Oh. Well, Brian and I are almost exactly the same age, and we grew up on exactly the same comics, so it just hit us at just the right time, I think.
I guess so, but I'm incredibly flattered that you feel that way. Thank you.
One thing I do love about Brian Hitch is he lived about 100 miles away from me growing up, so I didn't know him. We were at different schools, and one day my school had a school trip down to his neighbourhood. And I went into where he bought his local comics store, his local comics, just a little grocery store. And I bought an issue of DC Comics Presents that I saw there, and I took it away. And he told me years later that was the only one missing from his collection. And because I showed up in town 20 years before we ever met,
He's determined to get that issue, Mark. By the way, the two of you have done some pretty good work yourselves.
Well, sometimes you find somebody, that you and Frank make a great team. You and Grant Morrison, I thought, were a great team. I loved your Batman book, the Gothic book together. I thought was a brilliant piece of work, But sometimes you find somebody who elevates you, don't you? And I think Brian is one of those guys that brings out the best. And it doesn't always work. Sometimes there's brilliant creators who don't quite click with you, isn't there? And it's no slight on either party.
I think that's true.
The chemistry isn't there,
Yeah. I think that happened with Frank and I, that we were very much in sync with what we were doing.
Yeah. And that move to DC, I was not in the industry at the time. I was just a reader who suddenly was aware you guys weren't a Daredevil. And although you were for a few issues, which I loved, because the book felt very much a collaboration. You were drawing more and more of the book when Frank was writing it. Because he was just doing pretty loose layouts towards the end of his run, really, wasn't it?
Right.
But then you stayed on with Denny O'Neil for a little while afterwards.
Right.
But what pulled you over to DC? Was it Dick Giordano, or was it the opportunity to do Batman?
I think it was the opportunity to. It was probably Gothic, if I can recollect correctly. Right. It's always about the project and the people involved with the project. If somebody offers you a 5-issue run on a Batman story with Grant Morrison, you do not say no, regardless.
That's a great book. I love that story.
Yeah, thanks. We were talking over the weekend at the con. Somebody asked, what art do you have that you would never sell? And I had to think about it for a while, but Gothic, I have all those issues. I still have all those issues. Yeah. So there were like 2 or 3 projects that made my list, and Gothic was one of them. Yeah.
Wow. Do you know John Romita Jr.? I'm sure you know this because you know Johnny well. He's never sold a page from Kick-Ass. He's still got every single page of Kick-Ass.
Well, that's for a reason.
Well, I think he thinks it's going to be worth money. So
no, that's not it.
But somebody told me, I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me that, you know, the deal with the inker and the penciler is the inker gets a certain amount of the original artwork back. And somebody told me that Terry Austin's hung on to most of his pages. And it's that amazing period he was working with John Byrne. And these pages are worth millions of dollars now. I don't know if that's true, but I love the idea of Terry sitting on, you know, that mountain.
Yeah, I think that is true. I've heard the same thing, and you probably know too, Mark, that Walter Simonson doesn't sell any of his pages.
I didn't. I thought he hung on to some stuff, but
he has everything, everything, shelves, bookcases, amazing amount of work. Yeah.
See, I'd be hesitant. I just think my children are going to live like kings, you know, while I'm working. I'd really resent that, you know, like. One of my pals had this great idea for a business, and he's quite entrepreneurial, and he had this great idea where he said, instead of an old people's home, he wanted to basically burn up all the inheritance that you pass on to your children by having the best 5 years of your life in your 80s. And he said that his business was going to basically set you up with heroin and cocaine and skydiving and shark tanks and all this kind of thing. And just have the best 5 years of your life, because who cares if you're a heroin addict at 84? So what? You know, you're not going
to. Mark, sign me up, will you, please? Okay, things to look forward to.
But you know, it's better than watching TV, isn't it? You know, I think he's on something. You know,
I agree. That's right. Let's go out with a bang.
But you and Johnny are such a great team, though. I mean, I love seeing you guys together, and I mean, I think you're probably, see, when you visualize a gritty comic, you're probably the visual that comes into my mind. It's almost like there's little pieces of grit in the ink or something like that. It feels like Gotham City, or it feels like 1980s New York. Or whatever, you know, when you draw something. So you're such a perfect Batman artist or a perfect Punisher artist. And so is Johnny. I mean, Johnny's born to do
He is, yeah.
And it was so weird that I thought when they put you guys on Superman, like I'd heard a rumor you guys were going to do Batman, which would have made so much more sense to me, you know. What happened there? Did you guys choose Superman, or was it a DC idea?
Yeah, it was a DC idea. They were thinking, my assumption here is that they were thinking that John would revitalize the character. And I forget who the writer was.
I think it's Brian Bendis, I think, was doing this. Yeah.
You might be right. Yeah, it was Ben. You're right. It was Bendis. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty good team on paper. You know, the three of us, that's pretty good. But there was so many changes happening at DC at the time. You know, Dan DiDio was there, and you know, the different heads were then, you know, above Dan, and they were, you know, had different ideas. I mean, it was a very chaotic situation. Yeah. And I think it affected all of their books, and I would point to that as you know, something. Perhaps we didn't get enough of a push or enough marketing, but, you know, whatever it was, I thought the Superman that John did was some of his best work. The pencils came in. Pardon me? Go right ahead, Mark.
The whole package was great, but it just seems it's like you guys are like Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro. You know, it's like Batman just seems such an obvious choice, including Bendis. I mean, Bendis, of all the DC characters, Batman seems a perfect fit, you know, but it was just editorial shakeups going on then. It was that's
there was just a lot of tumult. Right. But I would, you know, I've kind of made the decision in my career not to ink as much, and there are certain people that I would just jump at inking. John is one of them. I hope John knows that. Frank, of course, I would ink Frank. Brian Hitch, as a matter of fact. I would love to ink Brian. I have never inked Brian.
I feel as if you and Brian have worked together. Have you guys never?
No, not that I can recall. And I think
I could really see that as well. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, I can too. And we've spoken of it. And his response was very cryptic. Oh, I'm saving you for something special, or something specific. I thought, oh, okay, all right. But there are certain guys that I would, come out of inking retirement for. And it's always about the project and the people that you work with, right, Mark? Don't you find that to be true?
Oh my God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've said it used to drive people at Marvel crazy. Like they would say, "Do you want to do this big book?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, but not with that artist." And they would say, "But the money will be good." And I was like, "I'd rather just watch TV for 12 weeks." And
that's right.
I don't want to work with somebody who I don't feel is right, And
that's right.
Because the feeling when you're with the right person is the best feeling in the world, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's not about the money. It's truly about doing something good and worthwhile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love us to do something. We were talking on email the last few days, but like I'd want you penciling and inking and coloring. I'd want the film.
Mark, I would love to. And I thought, by the way, that the Enemy of the State was one of my favorite projects ever. That turned out really, really well.
Really good. Really
Were you
good.
happy with it?
Oh my God. I mean, it's funny because Old Man Logan has sort of eclipsed it a little bit in terms of just the high concept, and there's the Hugh Jackman movie and everything. But I think as a piece of work, Enemy of the State is one of my favorite things I did when I was at Marvel. And
I'm glad to hear that.
Because I had you, Johnny, Paul Mounts doing a great job on colours as well. The whole package just really worked. It was
I
really
totally agree. Yeah, and it completely holds up. It's really wonderful. And I credit you, Mark. I think the story was really amazing. Yeah.
You're only as good as the artist you're working with, though. The power and I can remember every page. I could actually doodle each page because the shots were so exciting. Like the end of the issue 1 where you saw, like Wolverine, Elektra looking up and seeing Wolverine looming down. I mean, these could be t-shirts. Like you guys were just on fire with that stuff. It was great.
Yeah. I loved, and I don't know if you remember, but toward the last 2 issues or so, or 3 issues, we were very deadline conscious. The deadline was sneaking up on us, but it worked in our favor to turn out the pages so quickly because there was so much action, and so that great fight scene between Wolverine and the villain that we had, I forget what it was, really fed off of that energy of do it fast, do it quick, make it brutal, make it bold. And it really worked. It absolutely held together to the very end.
I forgot it was becoming a little bit of a deadline problem towards the end. And somebody said to me, "You're the only person who's ever made John Romita Jr. almost late," because Johnny's amazing on a deadline. He can do it in 6 days, But I remember Johnny saying to me, "Look, just give me some easier stuff to draw." And then the next issue came in, and it was a double-page spread of Wolverine riding a sentinel down into 1,000 ninjas, and then fighting 1,000 ninjas.
Yeah, I love that stuff.
And Johnny was like, "Oh my God!"
Just to say, Mark, I think that John doesn't get the credit that he deserves. I think that whatever credit he does get, it's not enough. I think he's much better than even the accolades that he does get. I think he's even better than that.
I think I hold him in such high regard. I can't imagine holding him any higher. To me, he's one of the living legends. Johnny's going to live another 150 years. He's in incredible shape, right? But when Johnny eventually dies in the 24th century or whatever, people are going to look back on him as like Kirby or
I think Dick. That's right.
Yeah, and they will be.
I think that's right.
Because he's had this. Who else? Especially pencilers, which is usually a relatively short career. It's usually under 20 years at the top. But Johnny's like in his 5th decade in comics, and he's still drawing Marvel's #1 book. There's nobody like Johnny.
That's right. And that's not a small accomplishment in this business. Yeah. That's huge. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm 54, and when I was 7 years old, I got a Spider-Man book for my Christmas, and Johnny drew the cover. That's how old Johnny is, you know. Like, so, like, you know, and he's still the top Spider-Man guy, which I love.
Yeah, and John's completely aware of how old he is, by the way.
But you know, he's looking good on it. You know, I mean, Johnny's still hanging out in the gym every morning. You know, so
he's fine. Yeah, he's absolutely fine, and he's doing the right thing. Absolutely, yeah, he's fine.
Well, before I go, your ambitions, you know, because you've had the most amazing career, but I still feel that you're one of those few guys, because I think Gil Kane, Joe Kubert, John Romita, you know, there's a bunch of guys who I feel their powers haven't dipped, and most people's powers dip over time, you know, like usually by the third decade, you see them getting a little tired or a bag of tricks or whatever. But you just seem to always maintain this incredible level of discipline, and the work is just so fantastic. You know, it's so impressive. Like, I feel as if you've still got very grand ambitions. Like, I feel there's a lot of great books in you. You know, like, what's your ambition that's as yet unfulfilled?
I do feel that I have some unfulfilled ambitions. Yes, definitely. And I appreciate you saying that very much, Mark. I really make a point of doing that. You know, being an artist that is focused on constantly improving and getting better, and that is, you know, that motivates me. That is my motivation. So I want to do good work. I want to do work that's better than I did yesterday. And it pleases me to see that, that happening, because I agree with you. You know, if I can be self-aggrandizing, I don't think that I'm one of those people that have lost it. I continue to finesse the line and you know, ink as better than I've ever inked, you know, certainly. And I think my penciling has improved by miles, you know, compared to even 3, 4, 5 years ago. And as a matter of fact, you know, if I can, you know, say, I think I finally got satisfied with the level of work that I was producing about 3 or 4 years ago. So I was already well into my 60s before I had a sense of, okay, this is pretty good. And in the back of my head, there's always that thought that, wow, you know, I never, and I'm revealing perhaps too much of myself, but I never thought that I would be capable of drawing this well. And I still have a lot of ways to go. But that level of acceptance has finally, you know, emerged, and I'm grateful for that. I feel more secure about the work that I'm doing than I ever have. So I'm hoping that I still have, you know, a decade or two to keep on going in that direction, and that I intend to. I'm not stopping.
What is the secret to that? Like Johnny, I think, still has an amazing vibrancy to his work as well. You know, like, what do you think keeps an artist as young as you seem?
You know, I think that's a really good question. It has to be psychological. It has to be emotional. You know, we go back to what we were talking about earlier, that the determinative factor in a student's success or failure is their personality. I believe in therapy. I believe in self-awareness. I believe in understanding what you're about and how to navigate the pitfalls and the flaws that we all inherit from our parents and from society and from religion and from politics. So that has helped me enormously to be self-aware and to understand how not to sabotage myself and how to continue growing. But even that has to start somewhere. So there is a hunger within me to be curious and to understand and to know things. And I think that has served me really very well. And then, much like John, I'm at the gym. I take really good care of myself because, your body is a tool and you need to keep that and maintain that. So I think it's a combination of, keeping mentally sharp and also physically, in good shape. I eat well, I sleep well, all those things, Mark. What were you going to say? Go.
Has teaching helped, do you think, in that regard, that being around young people and having fresh perspectives?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And I've stopped teaching, but that is the one thing that I do miss is but on the plus side of that equation, I still keep in touch with my students. I still keep in touch with people I meet at conventions doing portfolio reviews. If somebody needs some help, I'll give them my email, and that has filled in the gap of being in contact with the younger generation that I miss at school. Yeah. Absolutely right about that.
Amazing. Look, this one should be sent to every new comic book artist. I think this has been a great chat, Klaus. I've loved talking to you.
Thanks, Mark. It's been great to, I don't see you enough. So I hope to run into you at a convention or whatever, but I appreciate it.
Well, I'm definitely coming out to New York in the next couple of months. We should get a pint when I'm out. That'd be great. Yeah.
That would be great. Absolutely. I'm available. Mark, thanks very much, okay?
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. All the best then.